Welcome. This is the South Carolina State Library. We are the only state library in the state of South Carolina. We are a state agency, and we collect every outward-facing publication from every state agency. We also collect South Carolina materials, and we are committed to preserving all South Carolina materials. Among our collection are Arthur Sally, the first archivist of the state's collection that he personally annotated. We're committed to researching and preserving the history of South Carolinians. My name is McCabe. I am the South Carolina Center for the Book coordinator, and this is the home of the South Carolina Center for the Book. The Center for the Book is a Library of Congress program designed to celebrate the cultural and literary arts and heritage of each state and territory in the United States. We do this through events like this, author talks, and we also go to the National Book Festival and participate in crowdsourced fund programming like By the People transcription, where everyday people help the Library of Congress transcribe documents as far back as from the Revolution that have not been done yet. All of that's to say that we understand the importance of our public history institutions. We have a great example today of several different types of public history institutions: libraries, archives, museums, historical societies, and all of those save artifacts, primary resources, and are committed to the preservation, interpretation, and exploration of our history and continued growth as a society. So before we get started, you'll notice on your chair that we do have a little survey. If you don't mind, please take a moment to fill that out before you leave today. We do have some pens and baskets there. That just helps us to let us know if we're successful in this event and plan more like that. The event is being recorded today, courtesy of Historyman podcast, Eric Barnes, with Persimmon Lane Studios. To date, the podcast boasts an audience in all 50 states and over 40 countries, with over 70,000 downloads and counting. The podcast follows the history of the Southern campaigns of the American Revolution. Each 20 to 30-minute episode is geared to the Revolutionary War enthusiast. The Historyman podcast can be found on iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podbean, Audible, Player FM, Amazon Music, and Spotify. The man behind Historyman, Eric K. Barnes, American historiographer, CEO of Historyman LLC, and author of Historyman Comics. He memorializes history through various writing and audio projects. The Historyman podcast is the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution to the world. As CEO of Historyman LLC, he has expanded the podcast platform to include Historyman Comics. Young readers can learn about the real-life heroes that fought for the independence of the United States. Historyman Comics has completed 18 volumes of true stories of the American Revolutionary War connected to South Carolina. Each story is vetted for accuracy and are wonderful gateways of learning for future historians. Using the illustrations from completed volumes, Historyman Comics has ventured into animation using sound effects and voice-over actors. These animated episodes give a new genre for the youngest historians to learn South Carolina history. Find the links to these episodes on the front page of their website, www.historymanpodcast.com. Traveling the world by book or foot, you can find Eric walking in the footsteps of heroes and proclaiming, "Freedom reigns." Next, we have Dr. Elizabeth Chew, CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Dr. Chew became CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society in January 2024. A public historian, curator, and educator, she has worked at museums and history organizations for over 30 years. Prior to arriving in Charleston, she served as Executive Vice President and Chief Curator at James Madison's Montpelier in Orange, Virginia, and as Curator at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in Charlottesville. She received a BA from Yale University, an MA from the University of London, and a PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. Next, we have just Bill Davies, Vice Chairman of SC 250 Commission. William S. Davies, Jr. brings decades of leadership in law, military service, and historic preservation to the South Carolina American Revolution Sesquicentennial Commission. A graduate of the Citadel and the University of South Carolina School of Law, he served in the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps before practicing law with Nelson Mullins Riley in Scarborough for more than 35 years. He has long been active in preserving and promoting South Carolina history, and he currently serves as Vice Chairman of the Commission and is immediate past chair of the South Carolina Historical Society Board of Managers. He has also served as president of South Carolina Archives and History Foundation and of the Palmetto State Military History Foundation. His leadership with the Liberty Trail and numerous preservation organizations across the state reflects his lifelong commitment to honoring South Carolina's Revolutionary War legacy. Virginia Ellison, COO and Director of Collections of the South Carolina Historical Society, oversees all archival and museum operations for the Society. She earned her MLIS from the University of South Carolina and later received certification from the Academy of Certified Archivists in 2016. She also holds a Digital Archive Specialist certificate from the Society of American Archivists. Virginia is a past president of the Charleston Archives, Libraries, and Museums Council, CALM, and currently serves as president of the South Carolina History Network, formerly Confederation of South Carolina Local Historical Societies. She has been with the Society since 2012. Dr. Eric Emerson, Director of the South Carolina Department of Archives and Collections, State Historic Preservation Officer, and State Archivist, became the 6th Director of the South Carolina Department of Archives and History in 2009. He is past chair of the Executive Committee of the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, past president of the Council of State Archivists, and past chair of the South Carolina Hall of Fame. He also served as chair of the South Carolina State Flag Study Committee. He has authored a number of articles and books regarding South Carolina history and has edited 3 annotated editions of letters published by the University of South Carolina Press. A native of Charlotte, North Carolina, he holds a BA in history from UNC Charlotte and a master's and PhD in history from the University of Alabama. Rick Wise, Executive Director, CEO of the South Carolina Battleground Trust and military historian, is a native of Johnsonville, South Carolina, and a graduate of the University of South Carolina with a bachelor's in history, a master's in education and secondary education, and a master's in military history. He served over 23 years in the United States Army Field Artillery, was a paratrooper, and is a veteran of Desert Shield and Desert Storm, Operation Southern Watch, and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Rick is the Executive Director, CEO of the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust. He also pursues his love of military history through giving presentations and battlefield tours, was managing editor of the Francis Marion Papers, and is working with the development of the Liberty Trail in South Carolina. Rick and his wife, Paula, live in Camden, South Carolina. Thank you to all our panelists. Let's give them a warm welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. So they represent a lot of knowledge. And this idea came about because the State Library said, hey, SC 250, can we make an activity book for children? And as librarians, we want to make people think, and we want to make them research. And so we said, hey, people are saying, is it a gorget? I'm so scared to even say this. Is it a crescent moon? Is it a gorget? So we made our activity booklet, and we said, hey, kids, use primary sources. What do you think? And Mr. Davies came up to me in December, and he said, you're wrong. And I said, oh, no. And I said, well, we actually didn't say either way. We're just trying to show the importance of primary documents and critical thinking. But hey, why don't we do a panel and talk about this and say, wait a minute, it's been 250 years and we still can't make our minds up. Why? Well, because there's 6 people here that have done a whole bunch of different research, and there's 20-something people there that have done a whole bunch of different research, and there's a whole bunch of people out there that have also done research. And then we always are still learning things. So here we are. So let's start with our South Carolina flag design. Dr. Emerson, what can you tell us?
Thank you. Wow. So it's fairly simple. So the origins, we all know, go back to June 28, 1776. Well, it really goes back to 1775 when William Moultrie created a signal flag to fly from Fort Johnston. But as you said, McCabe, we learn something all the time. Nick Butler has been doing research in the British archives and discovered William Moultrie in his memoirs in 1831 said that this was the first signal flag that he had flown or something to that effect. And Nick said that British officers on the Cherokee and the Tamer thought the first flag was green. So, which is really kind of fascinating in itself because, I mean, did they think it was green from a distance? Could they not tell? Was it a different kind of blue? Was Moultrie? I mean, that's a really interesting thing. Is Moultrie's memories, are they shaped by what happened to the flag afterwards? But what we do know is that William Moultrie created a flag, and in his memoirs he said it was blue because the uniforms of the 2nd South Carolina were blue, and he put a crescent in the dexter corner of it because there was a crescent on their hats. And so that's really the only primary source material we have about the creation of that flag. So lots of people always say, well, it's a gorget. Well, it's, it could look like a gorget, and I could see people saying that, but more recently I've told car fanatics that, the brand new mid-engine Corvette looks a lot like a Maserati, but it's not a Maserati. So it's, you'd have to be a car buff to get that one. But so that flag is flown over Fort Sullivan on June 28, 1776, and that's the flag that Sergeant Jasper rescues when it's shot from its staff at the height of the battle, and that's the one that you see in all of the lithographs and the imagery of the battle. That's the flag you see. And so this flag is in the minds of the men who were creating the first official state flag in 1861 when South Carolina seceded from the Union. In particular, it's in the minds of one very important legislator whose father had created the Charleston Mercury, and he could use a newspaper to as a bully pulpit for his design. And so he hearkened back to this really important moment in South Carolina's history symbolically. And that's June 28th. And so he adds a palmetto tree onto that flag, onto Moultrie's flag. And of course, the palmetto is important because it had, it was a partially completed palmetto log fort that had sheltered the 2nd South Carolina and the other colonial troops there on June 28th. And we all know the story about the British broadsides bouncing off of those young palmetto trees. And so almost immediately after the battle, the palmetto tree takes on this significance that the states really never let go of. I mean, it becomes a really prominent part of the official seal of the state of South Carolina 3 months later. It's kind of a majestic palmetto towering over a broken oak tree, which represents the British fleet that had been defeated. So that's the first time it shows up in South Carolina symbology. And they would hold on to it. I mean, the regiment that went to fight in the Mexican War was a Palmetto Regiment, and it just carries on to today. The highest awards, the Order of the Palmetto, were the Palmetto State. I would almost feel bad for the Crescent because it's been kind of shunted to the side. Like the Order of the Silver Crescent's like a lesser award given by the governor for things. So, and then I could just keep going. So it's. You have that flag that's created in 1861. An important part of it is the fact that, the points of the crescent on that 1861 flag are pointing directly upwards. In In 1910, A.S. Sally, the first secretary of the History Commission, has legislation passed that allows him to have the final say-so on the official state flag, as secretary of the History Commission, and so he decides he's going to mess with that design. So he creates a crescent that he kind of jams into the corner. It's a smaller, fatter crescent, and he comes up with a palmetto tree that's not a great-looking tree. I can't speak because the one we chose was even worse. But but that becomes the official state flag until 1940, when legislation's passed to undo that. And Clemson University played a really important role in this because that legislation that Sally had created was legislation that said that Clemson were the only people who could produce the flag, and they had to do it at cost. And so the textile department of Clemson didn't appreciate the fact that they were doing all this work and couldn't make a profit off of it. So by 1940, they garnered enough legislative support to have that overturned. And so today, we don't really have an official state flag. So it's kind of something to think about. Anyways, that's a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is this thing working? Yeah. As I recall, you were the head of the commission, you and Walter. Is that right?
That's correct.
And
And that's Walter Edgar, correct?
Yeah,
That's
Walter.
correct.
So he's got credentials for all this. He and I could go on for a long time about this thing, but you wouldn't have gotten a better summary of it from anybody else in this world. This is a man that knows all about it.
Thank you. I don't know all about it. I mean, we're learning something every day, as Nick proved by digging into the.
I did remember one other thing. During the nullification crisis, people who were supporting the right to nullification wore a palmetto tree on their lapels. So it goes back a long way. And I think that palmetto flag you were speaking of was the first flag to fly over Mexico City when it fell.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so the South Carolina Regiment flew its flag over Mexico City as part of the occupation forces there at the end of the Mexican-American War. So a really, really important moment, I guess, for the state. But it's all born out of June 28, 1776, and that one day. And the reason that it's all happens for that is that's the first pivotal event in an independent South Carolina. I mean, you have to think that the Constitution of 1776 had been created on March 28, 1776, and so that document is kind of set South Carolina on its own path. And so as a newly kind of free, independent state as part of the United States of America, well, which wouldn't have been the United States of America at the time, provinces or however you want to say it after the Declaration of Independence, but South Carolina was looking for symbols. They're looking for something to identify themselves that early in the war. And it's kind of ironic because the really big battles in South Carolina that would shape how the war would end would come much later. And Charleston itself would fall in 1780. But all of that had already been established. The importance of the crescent, the color, the palmetto had already been established.
As we're talking about flags, one of the things is after the Battle at Fort Sullivan, Mrs. Susanna Elliott presented the 2nd South Carolina Regiment with two sets of colors, one blue and one red. And then later on, if you've seen the Ken Burns series and they're talking about Savannah, he talks about that at Spring Hill Redoubt, the French troops in their white uniforms attacked and made excellent targets, and they lined the ditches around the fortification. That may be true, but what he left out was the second wave was the 2nd South Carolina. And the picture that they displayed while he was talking about the French, you will see a crescent on that flag because the blue color was planted up on the parapet of Spring Hill Redoubt from the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. And the French may have been lining that ditch, so were men from South Carolina. So that blue, the blue set of colors was captured, later on taken back to England by General Prevost. It was in his family for years, and I believe in 1989, between the Smithsonian and the South Carolina State Museum, they acquired those colors, and they kind of get traded back and forth between the Smithsonian and South Carolina State Museum. Don't know where the red one is.
They're here currently.
Great.
Yeah.
The blue copies at the State Museum right now.
Fantastic. En route after this.
That one's on display at the State Museum, and the State Flag Study Committee. We were looking for crescents, and we took the crescent off the drum that's in the center of that one. The color that we thought should be the official color was there was an analysis done of the color on that flag, and a PMS was created out of that. So. That was an important part of what we offered up as a standardized flag. But Rick's right, an identical flag to that was red has never been accounted for. So we don't know where that is. I mean, that's one of the great mysteries of history. I mean, both of them would have been carried by flag bearers, and both of those men would have been shot, and Jasper's one of them, so. And I know they found the blue flag underneath one man, when the Royal American Regiment of Loyalists, is a Loyalist regiment, was clearing the battlefield afterwards. They found that blue banner, but we don't know what happened to the red banner.
Okay. Thank you all very much for that. So we know why we're here today, because of that. Now we know. But what got us involved in the American Revolution? What was going on at the time in the ideas and minds of the people of South Carolina there? I know several of our panel members are very much interested in the Articles of Association, what the everyday person was doing, the ideas, the overall enlightenment, and the intellectual grounding. Can y'all speak to that as to how things were at that time? Why were the everyday person so ready to fight?
I can talk a little bit about the Enlightenment and the kind of overall intellectual grounding, because before I came here, I used to work for Jefferson and Madison. So, we think about the Revolution as being inspired by, the ideas of people like John Locke, who went on to be the secretary for the Earl of Shaftesbury in the founding of the colony, and had impact here directly. But prior to, later, but things he'd written earlier were enormously impactful on Jefferson and many other of his peers who we think of as the founders. So my theory about how all of these brilliant people were in one place at one time is that many of the founders were sons of elite fathers who could afford to give them the best education available at the time. Some of them, went over to England, but many, I would say most, by the 1770s, were taught first at home by private tutors. And there had been a wave of immigration of well-educated young men, many of them from Scotland, who had been educated in Scottish universities and steeped in Enlightenment theory, were the tutors of people like Jefferson and Madison before they later went on to colleges like William and Mary and Harvard and Yale and what we call today Princeton. So the founders were all educated similarly. They had read a certain sort of group of works on political philosophy. So the ideas like Locke's contract theory of government, Locke's, very basically Locke's idea that liberty is a natural human right. They had read Montesquieu about the critical importance of checks and balances in government. And so when the difficulties with the British Empire, with British royal government here, became obvious. This was these men had the opportunity to think about if they were able to throw off the yoke of the British and, quote unquote, begin the world anew, what would they do? How would they shape it? And, many of them were in the same place at the same time, where they could have incredibly fertile and exciting intellectual debates about this. And this is where the ideas of the Declaration and later the Constitution sort of evolved. And that's, became this kind of shared ideology, and that also fed revolutionary fervor and revolutionary spirit in common colonists. And I use the word common to mean just kind of, everyday people.
You mind if I guess from my standpoint, I'm not as well educated as the rest of the panel here, but from my standpoint, I was trying to figure out, why did the everyday man, especially from the back country, why did they care one way or the other? What were they upset about, right? And so I did a little bit of research going back to your primary documents that you have here and you have at the archives and down in Charleston, and just give you a brief overview of what I have found, and then you can take that and add it to all the stuff okay? So September 1774, we're talking almost 2 years before the Declaration of Independence, right? So you had the Articles of Association, right? And the representatives from South Carolina were all wealthy, who could spend a great deal of time up north and not worry about their farms, okay? So we're very wealthy people: John Rutledge, Edward Rutledge, Henry Middleton, Thomas Lynch, and Christopher Gadsden. So they're all up there, and they come out with these Articles of Confederation, or Articles of Association. What are we upset about? What are we going to rally around? What are we going to combine forces over? What are these ideas that we're going to fight about? And so they passed those Articles of Association, and then November 5th, 1774, William Henry Drayton finds him a vacancy on the grand jury, and goes to the grand jury in Camden. This is Guy Fawkes Day. This is Gunpowder Day in Great Britain. It's a big holiday, and I think they did that on purpose. All right, so he makes a charge to the jury. And the charge is very long, and I'm not going to go into that, but I'm going to give it to you just because we're here and you're an audience, and we'll give it to you. All right? So he says, you claim to have these constitutional rights, and a lot of those constitutional rights that they understand are from what Ms. Chew was just talking about, that history of British subjects and how they understood government and how it works with people. It comes out of the Magna Carta, for instance, and how the individual has a say-so in determining their own life and how they work with government. So he says to the grand jury members, he says, you claim to have these constitutional rights, and you set up a government based on these rights, and that government in turn made laws. Well, you're still responsible as a member of this community to make sure that the law and the government act in the way that you set them up to act and still uphold your constitutional rights, okay? And if you don't, he would say it's a treasonable contempt of the very law that your constitutional rights have made, right? And so the citizens of Camden, the wealthy citizens of Camden, came back and gave their presentments to the grand jury, and they sent them down to Charleston. And among them, they said, we will put up our lives and fortunes to maintain our constitutional rights, not just for ourselves, not just for the citizens of the District of Camden that was on both sides of the Catawba River going up towards the state line, but for our posterity. Well, they get him back to, he goes to Sherall, they do the same thing. He goes to Georgetown. Georgetown basically says ditto, okay? So he takes them down to Charleston, and Charleston says, well, this is great, but we need a lot more people than just the wealthy people in these communities. And so he takes William Tennant, a Presbyterian preacher, and Oliver Hart. Tell me if I'm wrong now. He takes Oliver Hart and William Drayton, and they make a diary, and they go through all of South Carolina. And at the same time, they're having all these community meetings talking about their constitutional rights. And we know that that one of these documents survived the British invasion of Charleston in 1780, and you have had it on display across the state, right? Right, and it's the Association of the District Eastward of the Wateree River that came out in 1775, yes? So after this meeting, you can see a copy of that back in the room over here. But here's what's interesting to me, that it's 108 signatures just from the district eastward of the Wateree River in 1775. We're still talking a year before the Declaration of Independence. And some of these had to have a mark in the middle of their name. It looks like somebody transcribed their name, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, it looks like somebody transcribed their name and they put an X in the middle of their name and it says his mark. Leads me to believe that they could not write their name. They had to have somebody transcribe their name, and they put his mark. And you will see that in the Woodard name, and you will see that in the Atkinson's name, and several other names that are still unique to that part of the state, that Fairfield County, Kershaw County, Sumter County, that Woodard, Atkinson, those sort of names. I find that very affirming. And when I was doing research for these comic books and trying to figure out why the everyday man in the backcountry, took up arms against Great Britain, I find it very affirming that the people who signed these documents, some of them couldn't even read and write, but they're talking about their constitutional rights. And so they may not have had the formal education, but they certainly understood some of those premier ideals about not making a law without their say-so or their representative say-so. So these primary documents that you go back and look, you will still find them in places like the library or the archives. The original Camden Resolves are not a primary document anymore, but you can find them in the microfiche in the Gazette of December 12th, 1774, down in Charleston. But it's at the archives here in Columbia still, and you can find the names of the people who were on that document that sent that in, and the ones from Sherall, and the ones from Georgetown, and the ones from 96 that had a grand jury that's meeting that same month. So I find that very cool that we can still do that. And when we think about how history changes with the telling coming from different people, we can actually go back to the original source here in South Carolina, and we're very, very fortunate to be able to do that.
What an humble guy to start off with self-deprecation and then blow himself completely out of the water when he opens his mouth and proves exactly why he's sitting at this table.
I want to bring up something kind of simple that Eric referred to, but without thinking about it. South Carolina, according to Walter Edgar's book, had 9 of the 10 wealthiest individuals in the 13 colonies in 1775. And contrary to what they say in Virginia, Virginia is the cradle of creative history. South Carolina was really the wealthiest colony. If you're making so much money, why you want to go to war against this guy? I mean, really think about that. These people had these tremendous, the average income in the colonies, as I recall, was like 4 or 5 times the average income in England. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's right. I mean, why in the world would they not only want to put their lives on there, but these fortunes? I mean, these are really fortunes. They're revolting against their creative industry that they've set up. I mean, it's a fantastic thing, I think, and something I just think everybody ought to recognize.
We will.
The South Carolina Historical Society is not a state entity. It's a 501c3 nonprofit. We're the largest repository of papers related to South Carolina history. We have an extraordinary archival collection, which Virginia can talk about in wonderful detail, but we have a very significant collection of materials that basically tell the story of the Revolution in South Carolina. We have the majority of the papers of Henry Lawrence, for example. So our sort of #1 South Carolina founder, in the opinion of some. But I'll let Virginia talk a little bit about how many important stories we get out of our material in our archives.
Hello. So, yeah, like Elizabeth said, we're the largest private manuscript collection in the state. The South Carolina Department of Archives holds the official records of the state. And we have many wonderful archives, museums, and libraries throughout South Carolina that hold primary resources. So I always encourage you to ask an archivist or a librarian to come help you. But we have muster rolls, rosters. One thing that I brought notes because I'm not as established quite yet. My bio was a lot shorter. So where is it? We were talking about the palmetto tree. Here it is. So we hold the Richard Hudson letter book, and we were talking about the Battle of Sullivan's Island, and how the palmetto tree became our state tree. And so one of the notes is Hudson gives a detailed account of the Battle of Sullivan's Island, and he says, the little impression that the British cannonballs made on Fort Sullivan. So we hold the primary sources of what happened that day, and that's really powerful, even with a huzzah in the text.
Other firsthand accounts of that battle as well, including the 4th Regiment's order book.
And it's a 501c3, and everybody should belong, and so send money.
I just want to echo what Eric said. I mean, you did a great job describing that, Eric, so thank you so much, and thanks so much for putting so much effort into the graphic books that you produce so that young people can read and learn about South Carolina history. And echoing what my colleagues have said, primary source materials are so valuable, and the lack and the loss of them is it creates this atmosphere where we have to be treasure hunters, and we have to look at documents like Eric was talking about, the Articles of Association, which we have, and we have to kind of dissect what we see on the paper and then look at the context in which they were created. As Eric said, it's fascinating to me, and Bill, that men that wealthy would go to such lengths to rebel against such a wealthy country, to such an established country, and it was great lengths. I mean, you have to convince the overwhelming majority of white people in the backcountry who are poorly educated and just really want to be left alone to farm. You have to convince them that it's in their best interest to rebel against the most powerful country in the world. And that's an incredible kind of argument. And as Eric said, one good way to do that is to bring Presbyterian ministers with you. Highly educated men who, and they would always hearken back to the backgrounds of the men they were trying to convince. That this is what the British did to your grandparents. This is what they did to your great-grandparents, in Northern Ireland. You had to come here because of this kind of tyranny. And so that's the way you fire up people in the backcountry. You talk about liberties, you talk about rights, you talk about people infringing upon your personal liberties. And then it also becomes a counting exercise. The Articles of Association, as Eric said, there are X's on it, and you can tell someone's marking off names, and you've got a scribe that's putting multiple names down and then putting X's beside it. They're actually counting men who are there. They're comparing names to what's on the signatures to people's whose names are written down. And they would do that. The committees of safety would have to do that all over South Carolina, trying to estimate how much support they had. Would they have enough followers to kind of overwhelm loyalists in the backcountry? Because, the majority of people in the state are actually enslaved African Americans on the coast, but the majority of whites who can vote are places north of Moncks Corner, are in these backcountry settlements. And those are the people you have to convince to go to war, because they would ultimately be the people who won the war for South Carolina, and really won the war for the nation.
I'm going to add something to that. So we know that those documents were very important, and we know this, or we can read into this, because when the Declaration of Independence was sent down to South Carolina, after it was signed, we've already had the Battle of Fort Sullivan, okay, and there's the Declaration of Independence is read several times in Charleston in the early part of August, but they sent a messenger to find Andrew Williamson on the warpath to Florida. And with him, he has a huge army from the backcountry of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And they find them, the messenger finds them on the Altahama River, the late part of July, early part of August, and this is according to the pension application of Robert Wilson, who was with that army. And he says they saw the messenger, and I'm going to paraphrase what he said because we don't have time to do this, but they see the messenger across the river, and they call him over, and they realize what the message is, and they put the whole army in a hollow square, 250 men here, 250 men here, 250 men here, 250 men behind them. And they set Edward Lacey from Chester up on a tame horse. And he reads the Declaration of Independence to that whole army out in the middle of nowhere on the banks of the Altahama River in Georgia. And they all break out in such wild applause that Robert Wilson remembered it as one of those signature moments in his pension application in the 1830s. Now, if it was just signed by 4 people from Charleston, 3 from Charleston, 1 from Georgetown, the Declaration of Independence, all of them wealthy, why are all these backcountry militiamen breaking out in wild applause, so much so that they remember it 50 years later when he's doing his pension application? Why is that? It's because the 2 years prior to the Declaration of Independence being signed, they had a say-so in these associational documents that you will see and that you can still find in these archives and these records that are still here in South Carolina. I find that very, very cool. Thank you.
Very much so. So that brings me to about 17 more points. First of all, so we touched on the importance of the March 1776 South Carolina Constitution, the constitutions of 1776 and 1778, what we can learn from all these primary sources, these documents. Virginia, what other sorts of items can we learn from that y'all may have, like physical items that are still teachable to us?
Definitely. We have the Henry Lawrence Papers, which was our first collection. It was donated by his grandson in 1856. And it has the Council of Safety Journal, which was forming, now, caveat, I'm not a historian, I'm an archivist. I know a little bit about a lot of things, but not a lot about one thing. But that was kind of the early government of South Carolina in very layman's terms, but it's talking about the creation of currency in South Carolina. And then we hold that currency that was created from the Council of Safety, which is amazing that these little pieces, little slips of paper lasted, that they've been preserved and eventually came to an archive. We have maps showing the siege of Charleston. We have, as I said, many letter books and order books of the 4th Regiment and the 2nd Regiment, and then also the personal papers of families, you know, Thomas Pinckney writing to Eliza Lucas Pinckney, telling her that it's safe to return to, not safe, but she needs to return to Charleston. So we've got the everyday South Carolinian voices in our collections, and you've got those in so many places throughout South Carolina. We're really fortunate that we have a lot of local and family archivists that have preserved these for future generations.
Thank you. I always love those documents because that's where you're going to see a lot of the people you might not always see. You're going to see more of the roles of women and children. And I know the SC 250 Commission has really done an amazing job of making sure that the lesser-known heroes of the American Revolution are brought to light. And so that's, I think, where we find those things, and that's great. Two-parter. How do we get these documents out of war? Y'all are talking about, well, we pulled one flag out of under this body and we lost one flag. So how were we able to save these documents? How did that happen? And then can y'all each talk on what documents y'all have and what items and artifacts you have at your institutions? We can start with Rick.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to refer to the Francis Marion papers. For years, people have read about Francis Marion and, talking about archival information that you would have. if you're going to write as a historian, you're only going to be as good as the information you can get, usually from primary sources. And if you don't have those primary sources and you're trying to put the story together, you're going to have to do some analysis and make some educated assumptions. Okay, so I'm going to use Francis Marion papers as my example. So a guy named Dave Nealon was inspired by Disney's Swamp Fox, and he started looking for all this information. He read everything he could on Francis Marion, and it didn't add up in some ways when you did comparison. So he said, well, where are these letters that are mentioned, or these events that are mentioned? And so he starts looking, and he finds these letters from everywhere. University of Michigan collections, New York collections, It seems that most of the letters were up north. I don't know why. But anyways, of course, I'm being facetious. A lot of them migrated to the north from here after 1865. But anyways, so he finds these things. Even places that advertise they're selling actually autographs, but they're part of a letter, and he was able to get copies of the letter. So he was able to put together, I believe we have over 600 documents. And of course, you then marry them up with Francis Marion's orderly books and those sort of things to tell the story. And you can go to the Francis Marion papers. They're free online. All you got to do is Google them, go to the SC 250 website under education and then publications. They're absolutely free, 3 volumes worth. And if you go there and you look particularly from the 20th of February to about the 7th of March, 1780, you will find the information that clarifies what I'm about to tell you. There was something called the Rounds Campaign. After Greene goes up in North Carolina, he cajoles Thomas Sumter into taking action. Up to that time, Francis Marion is the only show in town at that time, and Rawdon and Watson are after him. Sumter goes and he attacks Fort Granby, puts Fort Granby under siege. If you go and stand on the pitcher's mound over at Founders Park, Carolina's baseball stadium, and look across the river about a half a mile or so, that would be where Fort Granby would be, in that general area. Anyways, he writes a letter to Marion on the 20th of February, the day he starts the siege, and says, hey, time is of the essence. You need to distract Rawdon, and again, I paraphrase here, if you got any extra ammunition, that would be great. And he sends this letter to Marion. If you read Bass and if you read Rankin and all the other noted biographers of Francis Marion, they will usually have the same refrain. Marion disregarded the letters. Marion did not respond. Marion dispersed his troops so he would not have to serve under Sumter. Marion did all these other things primarily not to be able to serve under Sumter. Marion said that the enemy was too strong. It had never been a problem before. He didn't want to serve under Sumter. And that has been the narrative until you find the primary source documents. It took 6 days for that letter to get across 2 rivers, go through bad guy territory, and find a guy as elusive as a swamp fox. And he got that letter. Actually, you would send out duplicates. He said it was the second letter he had received that morning. And he immediately responded, I will gather my troops, and by the 29th of February, I will be at the headwaters of the Black River. It was not leap year. He meant March the 1st. Okay, but if you follow his orderly book, he was exactly where he said he would be, when he said he would be. There was a further exchange of letters. Sumter said, you need to come to me. Sumter was over near Santee, over near Fort Watson. Marion marched. Sumter felt threatened. We think that Sumter went by way of King Street to get there. They marched past each other. Marion did everything he could to link up. The last letter received from Sumter, because they had literally switched positions. Sumter was now over near the Salem Black River Church, where Marion had just left from. Marion gets a final letter saying, come to me. He crosses at Murray's Ferry. If you've ever been on Highway 52 from King Street to Monk's Corner or whatever, hey, Murray's Ferry is right there where you cross Highway 52 there. You cross into Santee. Captain Zach and Candy from Camden tells Marion, Watson is over here, about 400 men, and it looks like he's going to start move towards Kingstree. And Marion forgot about Sumter and executed something called the Bridges Campaign, 4 engagements with the British. Okay, so all that would be lost if it were not for the Marion letters being able to explain that. And it also, these primary source documents revealed to me, if you would look at the depiction of Francis Marion that was previously held, is that Marion shirked his duty, he put his own feelings above what was supposed to happen, and as a military commander, you would not have wanted to serve under him. And with these letters, Marion was absolutely about duty first, not about his own thought processes. If he was ever down in the dumps about stuff, it was only because he couldn't get his men to stay long enough to plan a campaign. So primary source documents showed this very clearly. And from our perspective on that, hey, indispensable, without a doubt.
As the director of collections, one of the favorite parts of my job is handling donations to the society. So to answer your question about how do things survive, I think it's passed down through generations of like, this was important to my parents. Or to someone in my family, and then the next generation's like, oh, this was important to so-and-so, and I'm going to take care of it. That's what I seem to hear a lot when people call to donate or have a plan for materials if they feel that their children are not going to worry about it or want it in their home. I keep saying that COVID, Pinterest, and Pottery Barn have ruined the family archivist because that's one of the things that I'm hearing frequently, weekly pretty much, with donations is that, you know, my family doesn't care about this, but I do, and I want to make sure that it's passed on and preserved. So that's, and you never know where something's coming from or how much it is. We recently got a collection last December of 200 years of one family. It's about 30 Hollinger, 15 Banker boxes, to put it in scale. The Horlbeck family collection, showing the construction of the old Exchange building. They also own Boone Hall and have many of the account books. Moving on to the early 20th century women's rights and the preservation of Wadmalaw Island and zoning there in the 1980s. So it's a really fantastic collection showing these families' impact from the 18th century.
Thank you.
Just as a little bit more advertisement for the commission, we're working on the Thomas Sumter papers now and the Lord Rowden papers. So those will be available as soon as we can get them online.
So to echo what Rick said, without primary sources, we wouldn't have history. Primary sources are what everything comes from. People couldn't write biographies. People couldn't put together chronologies of battles. We wouldn't know anything about the past except for things that have survived into our time. So that's why the work of archivists and librarians is so critically important, because it is the story of us.
So going back to that question, you know, how did they survive? A lot of it was just luck, you know, and then people who had an understanding of how important the records were and during times in which they could have fallen in the hands of an enemy, either the British or Union troops, that they sought to secret them away. So, I mean, the state lost a whole lot when the British captured Charleston in 1780. And, you know, journals of the House, all these documents, and there are stories about things that were put underneath the old Exchange and bricked into the wall there, and then when they come back, then these are all just kind of anecdotal, but when people came back and you open it up, you know, all the water from underneath the old Exchange, and they're all ruined, and then these things get tossed away, and stories about the South Carolina Historical Society about, you know, filling in potholes in Charleston with them, and that's probably also, you know, probably really didn't happen. But anyways, that was one of the reasons the founders of the Historical Society used to found that organization. But, you know, these kind of foundational documents from the Revolution, they were not in the hands of the British. They were secreted away and kept away. So that's why we have the Constitution of 76, 78, the Articles of Association, why we have the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner. We have all of these because they didn't fall into the hands of the British in 1780. Now, some did, and as Eric talked about before, you have these Articles of Association. Lots of communities created them, but only 2 survive. We have 1 copy, and there's a copy at the New York Public Library that ended up in New York, just like the South Carolina naval records ended up in New York, and that's because when Charleston fell, Admiral Arbuthnot took all these records that he thought proved, sedition and rebellion, and he took them with him to New York. And then when New York has to be abandoned in 1783, you don't have room aboard ships, nor the desire to keep records of rebellion because you've lost. So you basically just leave them there. And they ended up in the hands of manuscript dealers in New York, and you see wealthy New Yorkers who buy these, and then they give them to places like either the State Library or the New York Historical Society. So the South Carolina naval records end up at the New York State Library, and in 1910 there's A.S. Sally's trying to get these back, and they don't want to give them back, and then there's a terrible fire that burns down the State Library, and so we get these singed copies back, so, and with a letter of apology. But so that's the kind of thing that happened. And other foundational documents survived because they had to survive the Civil War. So Secretary of State William Hunt, on February 16, 1865, he makes a point of having all the state's most important records put in crates, put on the backs of wagons, and carried to the Charlotte station, which was over on Lawrence Street. And so, and from there they're taken to Charlotte, and then back to York, and back to Charlotte, and then put in wagons and taken to Greenville where the government moves. But they only survived because of that. And they weren't found until the mid 20th century. And they were in the basement of the State House. Our copy of the Bill of Rights was found in a cardboard box under leaky pipes and was found by Edgar Brown, Senator Edgar Brown. And it's in terrible condition, but, the State House wasn't finished. You have to put them somewhere, so you start moving them around. It's just like when your parents leave you something, right? Where do you put it? In the attic or the basement, right? Because you don't have any space for it. And so the state did the same thing, but they survived. That's the important part. And it was because of people like Hunt and the founders who knew how valuable these records were going to be, who secreted them away when they had to be preserved.
Room.
Okay, since we were just talking about the Sumter papers, I've talked to Zach Limhouse and David Smith, who were working on the Sumter papers. Since I have the Archival Brain Trust here, have you seen any evidence of the Thomas Sumter orderly books anywhere? Those things are missing in action. Don't know where they went.
Well, we are quickly approaching an hour, and we do want to open up to questions for the audience. Before we do that, we did ask our staff if anyone had any questions, and we got one. And I know we mentioned the military pension records that we do have. Do we have that for Native American individuals as well? Our staff member mentions that his fourth great-grandfather, Lazarus Chavis, received a military pension in the 1800s. And what sort of records do we have regarding Native Americans?
There's records for Catawba and in the American pensions, and then accounts audited. You see people making accounts, making claims for things, for either pay for service during the war or for whatever they expended that they want the state to reimburse them for. So we do have records of Native Americans that served through pension files.
Thank you very much. So we are going to open up to the audience now, and what we'll do is ask your question. I will repeat it to the panel, and then they can answer as they see fit. Sir, I believe you had a question?
So many questions.
Let's start with one. Okay.
Was on the American Revolution was brought out so clearly. I'm interested in the opinion of the panel on the influence of Reformational Christianity and the drive for independence on the part of the American people at that point in the 18th century.
Okay, so that is a question about Reformational Christianity and the drive of the people of South Carolina and the American Revolution.
All right, Molly was just telling me about a book she had found. Molly, why don't you tell him about your book?
So a friend of ours, Catherine Cartier, out of SMU, wrote a book about religion and the American Revolution and imperial history, and it talks about exactly that relationship between the empire and its religion, and how it spreads throughout the colony, and how it supports government and different aspects of it. I'm only halfway through it, but there are a lot. I was surprised looking at the back of all the primary sources, speaking of, that she went through to really answer that question, because it is a huge one in the formation of the country.
And so what Molly said was Catherine Cartier from SMU is working on a book, or has a book out, called Religion and the American Revolution. And I believe that is going to be a part of one of the reading lists that we're producing, as well as that y'all are producing. And you can find that on SC 250's website for
It's
now.
Carte, C-A-R-T-E.
Sorry.
And I mean, the revolution happens between the First and the Second Great Awakening. So it's a really interesting moment of, sort of Anglican, control, then being sort of, pulled apart, by the itinerant preachers and the incredible influence they have over people, in the backcountry especially.
Yeah, those.
Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and all three have to work together.
Yeah, so that Reformed tradition, so the Presbyterian Church, Calvinism, the Reformed tradition in the backcountry, that's all being driven by all these Presbyterian ministers who were basically ministering to these backcountry people who've come down from Philadelphia through the Wagon Road and have populated North Carolina, South Carolina, and would later populate other parts of the Deep South. But yes, that's the Reformed tradition in South Carolina is what's really, and being able to tap into that is what's driving resistance. So it's anti-Anglicanism. It's which is really kind of fascinating, because the people who are spearheading the revolution are Anglicans, right? So and so, but that the Reformed tradition and all the Presbyterian ministers that are in those backcountry settlements, they're the ones that are firing people up, and that's based upon their treatment in Northern Ireland.
Yes, ma'am.
It's not a question, but a comment. If you ever come to Charleston, visit St. Philip's Church. Robert Smith, our Anglican minister in the 1740s to 60s to 70s, he was sent by the king. He was the only Anglican minister. We actually have his prayer book where he struck out prayers to the king and put prayers to the king. So he preached on Sunday and fought on Monday. We have all the archives at the church.
Repeat the name of the church again for me.
St. Philip's Church, Church Street in Charleston.
St. Philip's Church, Church Street in Charleston.
Free tours now.
Yes, Mr. Walker.
First, I'm not going to get you up for any more books today. I've got a state for one of the Erics and a question for the other Eric.
Okay.
I didn't realize you'd been our valedictorian, but you could have been, should have been. Eric and I were actually in high school together.
Oh.
To the other Eric, what was the reason or the symbolism of the crescent?
And that's a great question, right? So and that's a big debate. You have the kind of the trope of the gorget, but when it comes to the crescent, Moultrie calls it a crescent. So if you want to track that back to English heraldry, it first shows up in English heraldry from men who are returning from the Crusades. So they've come from the Crusades and they've seen this symbol, right? And it's a really ancient symbol. It pops up in Persia first, but you see it in Greek mythology. Diana, a virgin goddess of the hunter, she's always got the crescent with the points up on it's either on her head or it's somewhere around her in all that imagery. But you see it showing up as a symbol in English heraldry, meaning the second son or the second birth of something. You see that showing up in English heraldry, and it's being brought back from knights who have been on crusade. And so lots of people trace that. They'll say, well, William Bull was the second son of Governor William Bull, and he was in charge of he was lieutenant governor during the Cherokee War, and that's when you first see the crescent show up on the caps of South Carolinians. So you've got that, but then it shows up on the caps of Loyalist troops during the war. Now William Bull II or William Bull Jr., he's a Loyalist, right? So he's forced to leave the colony in 1777. Some people say that's it. So it's Bull saying, and then again people say, well, if it means second son, then South Carolina is really a colony of a colony, right? So South Carolina's a colony of Barbados, so it's the second son, right? And I've heard people say, well, the founders of Carolina are overwhelmingly the second sons of planters in Barbados, right? Because they're not going to inherit any land in Barbados because of primogeniture, so you've got to send your younger sons off to make their fortune. So you send them to places like Carolina, Jamaica, places like that to kind of, so there's all of these things that you could trace it back to. But all of them trace it back to a crescent, just like Moultrie said.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I've been curious about indentured servants in South Carolina, and are there any records of them being released from their bonds or anything to serve with the Patriots?
Okay, so that's a question about indentured servants, their role in the Revolution. Were they released from their contracts to fight, or what did they do?
I'm going to talk, but I'm not the expert here. So when you say indentured servants, are you talking about enslaved people, or are you're talking about indentured servants like Irish who come over and work off their cruise over here to the New World, that sort of thing, for 7 years, and then they're cut free? Certainly, Thomas Sumter's dad was an indentured servant. I find that interesting, and he always. I have been told that I have read, I don't know anybody that knew Thomas Sumter, so I have read that Thomas Sumter spent a great deal of his time kind of ashamed of his dad's indentured servant past, and he was always trying to strive for something more, and he didn't want to have anything to do with that. But that's... If y'all know of anything, please step up, because that's the one that it sticks out in my mind, simply because I'm writing comic books of all things. So, but
I don't know. I actually have a piece of paper that one of my family members was released in North Carolina to fight. So it goes back to, it just happens to be in our family Bible, put between two pieces of paper. So I'm sure that they exist, but finding them is tough.
So Molly, you have a record where your family member was released. Does it specifically say for the purpose of fighting?
Because we use it for our DAR paperwork.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you.
We'll take it at the Historical Society.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
The enslaved people.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, as far as my understanding, I don't know that they weren't allowed to fight in the beginning.
They were not?
They were not.
Okay.
To me, now, what I've heard, that they were not allowed to fight in the Revolution. And then later on, that they were, and I don't know why.
Okay. So the role of enslaved people in the Revolution, were they allowed to fight in the beginning, and then were they later allowed to fight?
So, you would see in enslaved people in all kinds of roles in South Carolina. And, free people of color in the Northeast, especially in Massachusetts. Like that first, the Minutemen, there were a lot of Native people among the Minutemen, and there were a lot of free African Americans amongst that. And then, there were enslaved people that accompanied partisan leaders and partisan, who were right there with them. And we can see that in the audited accounts. So we know there were enslaved people with Francis Marion. We know there were enslaved people with Sumter. And then, so, I guess it comes down to what does a body servant or a body enslaved person who's assigned to, who's with their enslaver and in a military capacity, Are they fighting for them, with them? So that's kind of a tricky kind of relationship. Are they of their own volition, or are they there because, of something else? Are they basically just tasked with going with them? Now, John Laurens in the war wanted to, Henry Laurens' son wanted to free enslaved people in South Carolina so that they could fight for the cause. And, and that's kind of a very Enlightenment idea, right? All men are created equal. And so, but that wasn't looked upon, that was frowned upon in South Carolina because you have a black majority in the Low Country, and so it's a massive amount of people that would be a big economic loss for planters. But there were enslaved people that worked in the naval yards. There were free people of color that worked in the naval yards. There were enslaved harbor pilots that, in fact, the best harbor pilots in Charleston were enslaved people. And in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, in fact, and during the Revolutionary War, all the best harbor pilots were enslaved African Americans, and in fact, 3 of them escaped early in the conflict. Thomas Jeremiah was a famous African American harbor pilot, and he was probably the wealthiest and most prominent one. And he was executed right before the war starts. People, the British thought it was on trumped-up charges of leading a slave revolt, but his execution, such a prominent man, such a powerful man, incited the next 3 chief harbor pilots from Charleston to flee to the British. And so they would harbor British ships into southern ports throughout the war. There was one aboard the Bristol at the Battle of Fort Sullivan. But they would have been free by the fact that they had, escaped. So it's really complex. That kind of relationship between freed people and enslaved people in the Revolution is far more complex than we think of when we think of the Civil War. Does that help some? Is that? Well, right. Well, if you're promised your freedom, sure. Sure. I mean, John Laurens, thought the idea was you free enslaved people if they serve, right? And so they would get their freedom for serving, and that's a concept you see in the Northeast at the time, because slavery ends much quicker in New England than it does, and you've got a regiment of Rhode Island troops that's made up specifically of African Americans, so it's a but in the South and South Carolina, there's no real big support for that.
The British offered freedom to enslaved people who, escaped, liberated themselves and ran to the British lines. And so then they, it's Lord Dunmore's proclamation. And there's a first-hand account written by the man whose life it was, who escaped slavery in Dorchester County, fled to the British in Charleston, worked with the British Army in various capacities. Then when the British evacuated Charleston, several thousand formerly enslaved people left with the British Army. And the British promised them freedom. Many of them went to the area around Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada. And the promises that the British made were not, always kept. And then the African nation of Sierra Leone was actually established for people who were freed, by the British Army, then ended up living in Africa. And the man from South Carolina is. No. Not in any kind of large way.
Dr. Fraser did a great study, and it's on our website for free. You can download it. There were many slaveholders that did emancipate or manumit their slaves. Larry Watson. Dr. Larry Watson. And on our website at SC250, we're one of the only states that has done that catalog of manumissions that happened during the American Revolution so they could free their slaves. So it's a very complex and very complicated
do they have records or pensions for the ones that didn't?
They're Bobby Moss and Michael Scoggins wrote a book. I'm sorry. Bobby Moss and Michael Scoggins wrote a book about the African Americans in the Revolutionary War, that fought in the Revolutionary War. And it lists pension applications from those in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and all up and down the colonies. You will find that very interesting. I will mention two, just because I know about them. I'll mention Isham Carter from Bamberg, who joined the Patriot forces, the artillery unit at the Battle of Stono Ferry, went to Savannah and went to Charleston, was captured at Charleston. But he fought, he was right there in the midst of those artillery barrages at Stono Ferry and Savannah and Charleston. And another one would be Ishmael Titus, who came down out of North Carolina, fought at Camden, fought at Kings Mountain, and actually saved his commanding officer from kidnapping. But there were several at Kings Mountain, and one of them actually, his history or the legacy is that he was one of the people that fired the final shot that killed Ferguson at Kings Mountain, and it was one of the guys, a black gentleman at Kings Mountain. Andrew Ferguson, that's right. That's right. So I would urge you to go find that book, and you will find a whole great deal of history from that. It's African Americans in the American Revolutionary War by Michael Scoggins and Bobby Moss. Okay? Get with me afterwards. We'll talk about it some more.
And the SC 250.
Another African American is Jim Capers. Jim Capers, if you read his pension statement, he was at the Battle of Camden. He later joined Francis Marion. He was with Francis Marion during his campaigns, and at the Battle of Eutaw Springs, he was the drum major. And you're like, well, so what? He's the drum major. Okay, he was the head signal guy for Francis Marion. Okay, but they did all their commands by drum. And at Eutaw Springs, he was cut on the face twice, received another wound, and actually got shot through his left side and killed the drummer behind him. Okay, somehow, at least according to his pension statements, he recovered from that in time that by mid-October, he was at Yorktown and witnessed the surrender at Yorktown. Okay, but another primary source, a guy named Otho Holland Williams, deputy adjutant for the Southern Continental Army. When Marion went up into North Carolina and joined up with them, Otho Holland Williams wrote about his arrival. And he said, a Colonel Marion of South Carolina arrived with about 20 men. They were young, they were old, they were black, they were white. Their clothing was, I forget the word that he used here, but basically, yeah, they were laughed at. The only good thing about them is they were mounted. No, so yeah, that's another example, and you know, one of the people that we look up to exceedingly is Oscar Buddy Marion. He was Marion's manservant, yes, but they grew up together. They hunted, they fished, they did everything, and he was with Marion throughout the war. And, oh, by the way, Buddy's dad was put in charge of running all of Marion's properties. You know, they got destroyed by the British, but he was the guy in charge.
There really are a lot of places you can read about blacks in the war. Early on in the war, Washington, as head of the armies, refused to accept the fact that black people should be enlisted. But the units themselves, many of them were governed more by the states, and at places they would enlist them and make them actually, you know, rifle-carrying soldiers or musket-carrying soldiers. But there were also situations where a slave owner would send a slave in place of a white person who was supposed to go. So if you start reading about this stuff, and that Bobby Moss and Scoggins' books is a good place to start, you'll find really there are a lot of these stories. It's a whole lot more than you would think.
Yes, sir.
New question. So what is your take on AI in history? I just see a lot of just inaccurate stuff all over social media. To me, it's ruining history.
All right, the role of AI in history.
It's complicated. It's complicated. Just all over. There's wrong dates, wrong battles, wrong uniforms, wrong guns. People are sharing it.
It's making the role of librarians very necessary.
Yes, although my friends ask if I'm obsolete now.
No.
But I think AI is a tool. It's still in its early stages. And if used properly, it can be a good tool. Not quite yet. Internally, we're tracking how many reference inquiries that we get. You know, when someone mentions AI, or like, AI told me you have this, or AI told me about this event, or about this person. And it's been pretty interesting because AI will say that we have a collection, and it will use the format of our collection ID numbers, and then send us on a goose chase for about 4 hours to realize that it was all wrong. And we may have it, or we may not have it. You know, someone called the other day and said, well, do you have a Bible on this family? And I said, no, sir, we don't. And he said, well, I just used AI, and he says it's in Indian fields. I'm like, well, then why'd you call me? But I think it can be a useful tool at some point, not quite yet.
You know, Dean, just to answer your question straight up here, dude, I went and did a presentation in my hometown, and they knew I was coming, and they put together a flyer. I saw that. Yeah, and hey, and they put a Rick Wise on there, and had the Marion papers, and there were like 2 other guys on that on the books that they listed that I have no idea who they are. I'm presuming this was a Rick Wise, but you know, hey, I still have my hair, so I'm happy. But I will tell you, I have used AI to look at things, and unless you have someone who is very up on their game to be able to look and see where the problems are. I mean, can you use it? Yes. Am I a fan? Sometimes.
I will say that one of the roles of the South Carolina State Library is we offer consulting, training, advice, anything and everything that we can to the libraries throughout the state. And we've recently started looking into AI. And the county libraries are getting questions from patrons, and so we're helping them address those. How can we help guide them? Some of the research that we have does show, like, if AI is used without being noted, you will lose credibility. Also, AI is basically a Google search. It's going to go through the metadata, and it's going to see Indian land or cannonball or this or that, and it's going to bring everything to you, not specifically in an order of relevance or credibility or anything like that. So unless you have those skills of discernment to say, hey, this is a valuable source, your media literacy, and we've also had some issues where we've had flyers where we've had author images, and we're just, well, what? And then it is a situation where someone's like, well, wait a minute, if this picture doesn't match who this person is, what about the words? And once people lose faith in what you're saying, it's really hard to get it back. So I would always say err on the side of caution, let it be known that you're using it, and they didn't have it in the American Revolution. All right, so any more questions? Yes, ma'am. So that question is about what role did Native Americans play in the war, and were they offered any sort of financial, monetary compensation?
Well, so, I mean, the Catawba played a really big role in South Carolina. I mean, they in serving the state. And so, and pension applications and audited accounts show they were being reimbursed in the same way that other people who served were. So that's the kind of same kind of compensation you would have offered to someone who was in the regiment or who was in the militia as well. So,
And just to follow up to that, we asked a representative of the Catawba Nation when we were up at their place some time ago about why the Catawba mostly sided with who we now call the Patriots. They weren't, you called that then, and she said it was because we thought our ability to get what we wanted would be better with them than with the British. And we fought the Cherokee not only because they were in Clemson, and you always fight those people, but we fought them because they thought they were better off with the British. The British were putting lines and saying, you people can't move into Cherokee lands. And everybody who was the Patriots was saying, let's go that way. And so that's, some of the native people they weren't necessarily getting paid or anything, but they thought their lives would be better if they supported that side of the conflict.
If you look at the Battle of Hanging Rock, if I remember the roster correctly, there were at least 28 Catawba there with General New River at Hanging Rock. But if you go looking for these folks and you're like, well, this should be easy. Hey, you're not seeing running deer and all this stuff. You're looking for names like Peter Harris, so it makes it more difficult to pick that out. So you have to go through the pension statements. And if you all are interested in pension statements, you go to Rev War Apps. Rev War Apps, outstanding. The old Will Graves and Leon Harris have done an unbelievable job. What are they at now? Over 25,000, is that correct? Pension statements on there that these guys have put. You can search for them alphabetically. You can look for it. You can do a search by battle, whatever you need to do. So it's an outstanding primary resource.
Wonderful. Well, we are closing in on 4 o'clock. I want to remind everyone that this is the South Carolina State Library. This is your library. Every resident of South Carolina 18 or older is eligible for a free library card. You can sign up in person. You can grab one of those wonderful fans we have. On the back is a QR code. It'll take you to our library card sign up. You can immediately get access to our online resources, which include major daily newspapers, historic South Carolina newspapers, digitized documents. We recently digitized Eli Kershaw's ledger. We have lots and lots of state documents. We would love to help you. Anything we can do, just ask. Before I let these people go, I have a couple more questions, and then we invite y'all to please explore the library. We have the Art and Archaeology of Fort Mott traveling exhibit from the State Museum. We have a small exhibit about the palmetto tree from the relic room. And then we have tables from some of our participants as well as the library in there. Please take a look around, ask us questions. We are here to help. And then finally, I want to know from y'all, what is the most underrated or hidden gem that you consider revolving around the Revolutionary War? And then what should every South Carolinian know about the Rev War, especially if we're going to leave this state and tell somebody something? What should we know?
McCabe, if I can start, I would like to start before the Revolutionary War to the thing that you ought to know. On August the 18th of 1526, a Spanish expedition came into what is now known as Port Royal Sound, and they named a point of land after St. Helen. It was her feast day. That point of land and that name appeared on a map issued in 1526, late 1526, by Juan Vasquez, who was an Italian in Spain. And the name of that point is Santa Elena. That was August the 18th of 1526. What's today?
July
In a month,
16th.
we will celebrate the 500th anniversary of a place name in South Carolina, which is the first we can find in any European writing anywhere. Now, I don't know about the Chinese.
Okay, I will tell you a gem that's actually, I use it in all my presentations now. There's a guy named George Bancroft. He started writing the history of the United States in 1840. He was Secretary of the Navy from 1845 to 46. He created something called, what's it called? The United States Naval Academy. Okay, so he's got some wherewithal. He had 10 volumes of his history of the United States. And some folks have said that when he did his revisions after the Civil War that he maybe cut down on the role of South Carolina. That's why people don't know about it. Textbooks may have done that, but I did my own research. And he cut from 10 volumes to 6. He said he declared war on adjectives. If you look at the statement I'm about to tell you, it was about 2 paragraphs long, and he cut it down to 1. But he said this about South Carolina's role in the American Revolution. And his last edition, the revised one from 1885, he said, left mainly to her own resources, out of her wretchedness, her sons were to bring her back to her place in the Republic, having suffered more and dared more and achieved more than the men of any other state. That is pretty significant. And the work that we have done and we're trying to get out to people is that South Carolina did play a major part in winning the independence of this nation. From 1780 to 1782 particularly, the war was being fought here. Yeah, there was Guilford Courthouse, and of course Cornwallis after Guilford Courthouse went up to Virginia for Yorktown, but it was because South Carolina would not quit. That's how we won our independence.
I guess I would want people to know that South Carolina's first constitution, March 26, 1776, set up a government that mirrors exactly the government we have today in its major points. I mean, and that's established months before the Declaration of Independence. And it, in very South Carolina fashion, we list more grievances against Great Britain than the Declaration of Independence. So, and then I think that you know the rest of it. I mean, South Carolina is so proud of its role in the American Revolution. And it has committed so much effort and so many resources to letting the world know all that this state did to guarantee America's freedom. So I would hope people would contemplate that and not just think of, you know, those other states up north. There you go. Virginia.
Other than to ask your local librarian. But I think just, sorry. We had a pop-up exhibit at the Historical Society June 28th through July 4th, and honestly, I didn't think anyone was going to make it up to the 3rd floor to see the additional materials that we brought out from our collection. But we had, even during the weekdays, we had over 100 people come upstairs, and we had the opportunity to have that one-on-one discussion about each document and about South Carolina's impact in the American Revolution, which many people from outside of the state weren't aware of. I was surprised at how many visitors we had on July 4th. I thought everyone would stay at the lake or the beach, honestly. But they were tourists coming for the 250th or just coming downtown for the day that wanted to hear about our role in the American Revolution, had never heard of Carolina Day, said, why is this flag everywhere? What does it mean? So I think, right, simply, I think we should all know about Carolina Day. I didn't know about Carolina Day prior to working for the Historical Society. I'm a little bit ashamed to say that, but I've learned a lot of others weren't aware of it as well.
I want to hold up our South Carolina founder, Henry Lawrence, who I think everybody in the country should know about. He was one of the very wealthiest men in the colonies, at one point the largest slave trader. He played roles in the revolution at every single level that was possible, from being a member of the Committee of Safety in Charleston to being the president of the Continental Congress. He was so important that when he was going over to ask the Dutch for money, he was captured by the British and is the only American ever to have been imprisoned in the Tower of London. He was so important that he was traded for General Cornwallis. And my very favorite item in our collection is a little note that Benjamin Franklin wrote to Henry Lawrence, letting him know that the Treaty of Paris had been signed.
I think I did an episode with Scott Seifert, who's a lawyer out of Charlotte, and we were talking about the importance of the history that we're talking about, the importance of the Revolutionary War history. How does that apply to who we are now? And he made a good comment. He said some of the same questions that we have as far as the individual and how they relate to government and how government is supposed to relate to the individual, those same questions that we have now, that we debate every day, were some of the questions that they had at the turn of this revolution. And we fought, our ancestors fought back then to kind of create this republic. And Franklin said, if you can hold on to it, right? If you can hold on to it. So telling the history and using primary documents to tell that history is very important, not just for ourselves, we're a little older, but for our young ones. We need to inculcate our young ones to what it is to be an American, what it is to be free, because they are, they can be moved about by the wind. And the primary documents are kind of like our Gibraltar in many respects of who we are and the American experience and what freedom means to Americans and how freedom is defined in the world.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists one more time. And then I would like to ask everyone, if you don't mind filling out the paper survey on your chair. If you did register, you will receive a survey via email. Please sign up for your library card. Please sign up for our newsletter, the More newsletter. It lets you know what events we have coming up. We'll have Eric Barnes here on the 27th of August talking about his comic series and how he's inspiring the youth. Please engage with us, look around, take our stuff. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.